And welcome to another exciting episode of The Energy That Surrounds Us. I'm your host, Michael, and I am joined tonight on this special time with a very cool guest who has some really cool experiences to share with us. And so, without further ado, I am going to turn it over to our wonderful guest, Joshua Cutchin.
Hi there, it's great to be here.
Thank you for coming.
Yeah, it's a nice way to start my week more or less. I didn't have anything like this last night, so this is a good start to the week.
Well, I'm glad we can be a great, fun start. So, for those who may not be familiar with your work as an author and everything, could you give our audience a little bit of your background?
I'd be happy to. It's been a long and winding road getting to this place right here, sitting with you. Um, my I guess if you really look back on my career towards writing about this sort of thing, it started back when I was a kid. I was something of a monster kid. If there was a creature feature or anything like that, I was there for it. So the Ray Harryhausen movies and anything by Stan Winston, all those great creature designs and stuff, I was there for it. But I also had a sort of interest in Bigfoot to begin with. Um, and it was this sort of thing was never really frowned upon in my household. I know a lot of people grew up in households where we don't talk about ghosts or UFOs or anything crazy like that. But we weren't. My parents weren't necessarily into these topics, but they didn't really have a strong opinion either way. And of course, we all sort of believed in ghosts because that's just made sense to us. Um, Years later, I found out that my dad had subscribed to the BFRO newsletter, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization. So maybe it runs in my blood a little bit. But so I would sort of dabble with this sort of subject matter from time to time, and my parents were always just happy that I was reading. Um, but it wasn't until I took a desk job in 2012 that was an hour commute from home that I really jumped into these topics with both feet, I guess. That was back in something of I would call it maybe the wild wild west days of paranormal podcasting. I know that there's a lot more now by orders of magnitude, but I feel like that was really sort of a golden era back then. And so that was naturally, I was like, well, this is an interest that I've always had. Maybe I'll listen to some of these podcasts on my way to and from work. And it really rekindled a lot of this stuff. And so I was really getting back into this sort of subject matter. And I distinctly remember my sister-in-law got me a gift card to Amazon, and I was like, I'm going to buy a Bigfoot book. And I read J. Robert Alley's Raincoast Sasquatch. It's a wonderful book. And I distinctly remember that there was a reference to one of the Alaskan tribes who said that in their culture, if you were to take food from a Bequus, which is their version of Sasquatch, you'd be trapped with the Bequus forever. Now, for whatever reason, over the years, I had remembered that a very similar prohibition was discussed often in the fairy folklore of Western Europe. I've since come to learn that it's a very widespread, almost universal belief amongst a lot of indigenous cultures. But I was like, wow, that just struck me as so unlikely that you'd have these two cultures from literally the opposite sides of the planet, right? That would have that same warning about accepting food from beings other than humans. Because in places like Ireland or the British Isles or Scotland, it was said that if you accepted food from the fairies while in fairyland, you would be doomed to stay trapped in fairyland forever. So it was just so specific to me that I was like, wow, that's a really good idea for a book. Someone should write a book on that. And I sort of sat around for a while and I was like, oh, I guess it's me. So my first book, A Trojan Feast, came out in 2015. And since then, I've been fortunate and blessed enough to have gotten a lot of good reception from my other work, and it's turned into a career alongside with playing music. So in a lot of ways, living the dream over here. And now here I am, depending on how you count, 7-ish books later. It's kind of difficult because some of my projects get split in two because they get so long. But 7-ish books later, I've got a little library that I've written all to myself. And what my work tends to focus on is still very true to that initial impulse that I had to compare these things, and it is that sort of folkloric comparison of belief about paranormal entities. And I cast a very broad net when I say paranormal entities. I mean UFOs and stuff like that as well. Comparing those across time and across space, across the world, to illustrate how it seems that we are interacting with something that has some sort of subjective quality to it. That's sort of the core of my work. That, and I like to look at aspects of these phenomena where they get mentioned a lot, maybe in passing, maybe somebody will dedicate a paragraph to it, but I stop and say, I've read that in like 10 other books, and no one's really ever explored it. So that's what my body of work is focused on. So the first book was A Frozen Peace. It was on that food heavy that you mentioned. My second book is a good example of me taking one of those tiny details and exploring it. It's called The Brimstone Peace, and it's about looking at the smell of sulfur across all these different encounters. The third book was about supernatural child abductions. It's called Peace in the Night. Then I wrote Where the Footprints Been, Volume 1 and 2 with my co-author and friend Tim Skinner, which is basically the strangest Bigfoot account you can find. And then my latest non-fiction work is Ecology of Souls, Volumes 1 and 2, which is looking at all paranormal phenomena related to that. And my latest book is my novel, The Old Days of the Dive. It's just sort of as a palate cleanser, because Ecology of Souls ended up being a massive project. And I was like, I need to take a step away and try this from a different angle for a little while. So that's sort of where I am today in a nutshell.
So I find it interesting that you say like career in music. So did you, while you were doing music, did you ever be like in a concert and be like, did I just see what I think I saw? Did I?
Every gig
really
is like
happened?
That. Every gig is like that. No, so yeah, I for the longest time I was on the career musician path with an eye towards orchestral tuba playing. I'm a tuba player. I don't double on anything else. I like to say that I play trombone at the level of a very talented but unmotivated sophomore in high school. So, but anyway, I was on that road for a very long time. I ended up having some performance injuries that I've since recovered from, but that sort of knocked me off of that trajectory. So that's how I ended up winding up with 2 master's degrees, one in music and one in journalism, because I was like, okay, well, I'll do arts criticism or arts PR or something, and that was my first position, was an arts PR job. But since then, I've again, my performance injuries have recovered, and I am first call jazz tuba player in the Atlanta area. So it's something that is honestly a lot more fulfilling than sitting in the back of an orchestra and counting rests all day. But musicians are a strange bunch. And it's always interesting to go into these situations, and when I'm around my UFO and Bigfoot friends, they're always like, "What's up with the tuba?" and when I'm with my musician friends, they're all like, "What's up with the UFO and Bigfoot thing?" But a lot of musicians have had a lot of strange experiences. A lot of musicians are fans of Coast to Coast AM because it's usually the only thing that will keep them awake when driving back from the gig at 2 a.m. But yeah, I mean, the things that I always find so compelling about sort of the intersection of music and the paranormal, and you get this in, commercial styles like jazz and rock and stuff like that, funk. There is sort of a group mind that develops sometimes in really good performances if you've played with people for a long time. And I remember with my first band, which is a New Orleans style brass band, I had played with the drummer for, at that point, well, it felt a lot longer at the time, I guess, but probably around 8 years. And we had gotten to the point where it was me and him on every single show, more or less, and I could just look at him, and without really saying what I was going to change the style to, I'd change, and we'd both just like lock in right on a dime. We'd change on a dime, and I know that part of that is just playing with someone for a long time, but at the same time, it could feel, it had the potential to, and sometimes did feel so uncanny and instant that I was like, are we doing something here? Because playing a brass instrument, I don't have the opportunity to yell out what I'm going to do, especially in the seat that I occupy, because I'm playing constantly. So there's that aspect, and there's also, I would never, ever in a million years claim that I am a great improvisational soloist. I know my way around chord changes, so that's more of what I do in that sort of on-the-fly music making. But I will say that sometimes when I have taken an improvisational solo, and often when I'm reading chord changes, stuff just happens automatically. And there are instances where I have gone back and listened to what I've done, and it seemed so, what I have done in those fleeting moments has seemed so far beyond what I estimate my own capacity for musicianship to be, that I'm like, did this come from somewhere else? And the more you talk to people who are involved in those sort of improvisational styles, you'll find that that's a real common theme, that there is this flow state that you sometimes can slip into. Some of us are better at it than others, but this flow state where everything becomes not only highly virtuosic, but also automatic in a way as well, where it just doesn't even feel like you're consciously making those decisions. So that probably is a big part of why I've stuck around with music, is not only the spontaneity in the sort of things that I do nowadays, but also to get to tap into that feeling, because it is a really special thing. And then there's also something that I think doesn't get addressed enough, and it's the fact that a room, a venue, what have you, can feel extremely different. And just depending on where the crowd is at, and it's sometimes you just walk into some of these crowds and you're like, oh, tonight's going to be an absolute drag because you can just feel that there's no energy in the room, right? And sometimes you'll walk into the room and you'll be like, oh my goodness, what is happening? Like, this is something that we're going to plug straight into, and it's going to be a great time. So, and I don't really know what that is. I could sit here and speculate on things like mass hysteria and egregores and things like that, but there is a tangible difference that you cannot necessarily control, and it just depends on how much you're getting back from the audience. Yeah.
So I'm curious, as you're talking about when you're playing in the flow and you go back and listen and you're like, is that really me playing? Have you ever tried to duplicate and be like, why can't I make it sound this way? Or, I really can play this way.
Well, it's so much of, that's one of the things that I've always found really interesting about, at least from that sort of classical Western tradition, whether it's strings or woodwinds or percussion or brass. In my experience being around those groups of instrumentalists, so much of learning to play an instrument well is just getting out of your own way. It's just getting out of your own head and not trying to, the time for evaluation comes afterwards. You listen to a recording, but classical musicians are very bad about evaluating on the fly. At least that's the way we all start out, right? Because we're trying to get better, and so we're evaluating as we go, and that can often get in our way. So that's part of it. If I didn't have some of the commitments that I did, including children, I probably would go back and try to recreate those moments and spend time in the shed, as a lot of us musicians refer to the practice room as. But no, I haven't really made much of an effort to do that. But it's interesting, because there are some things that some of them I don't think can be recreated, because especially if you're playing live music in a really exciting venue, you are, as I alluded to, you're really plugging into the crowd as much as you're doing something yourself. And there are these sort of vague, ill-defined concepts like the groove, right? And if you try to do that by yourself, you can groove by yourself, but grooving with a group of other people and falling into that sync is really where it's at in terms of having those moments. I would love to see some studies at some point whether or not musicians' heartbeats in a setting like that sync up. There probably has been some research done, but I would not be surprised at all if once you get a close group of friends who are making music together, if there isn't sort of a synchronization of everything from heartbeats to blood pressure and everything in between. Right.
Yeah. I was curious because my line of thinking where I was going with it was maybe you like kind of stepped aside and a spirit came in and played, and that's why you like.
No, I mean I am completely sympathetic to that viewpoint, and it's a lot like any creative endeavor in the fact that I was reading an interview with Ray Bradbury, and it said, towards the end of his life, he was saying that he would just sort of in the wee hours of the morning go down to his study and pull one of his books off the shelf and read it, and he'd just look at it and be like, I have no idea where this came from. And there really is a lot of that. I mean, I think it was either Haydn or Handel, and all my old music professors are screaming at me right now, but one of them said that the only thing he ever really wished for was a good melody to come to him, because everything else about the actual like creation of the form and the structure and the harmonization and whatnot was second nature, but that actual initial good melody was the thing that he felt like he really had no control over. It just kind of had to come to him, and it is like that. The more you force these things, generally the worse the results are. So there was a time back when I was drinking where I would just, sort of get trashed and write music, and some of that stuff I still play today, and I'm like, that's pretty good. I have no idea where that came from. Again, getting out of your own way, but in getting out of your own way, do you sort of invite something in? And that's a story that's, as old as time in terms of artists in general, sort of being in contact with whatever this other thing is, and I think that there is something to it. You look at these phenomena, always seem to have a soft spot for artists. The artists and musicians were the ones that the fairies always kidnapped, and there is a loose correlation I think you could make between creative types and UFO experiencers today. So I think that it really does come right up against that line between the imagined world and the real world, and how artists sort of bring that into being. And sometimes we do become vessels, I think. Yeah.
And it'd be interesting because it's like being paranormal, and a music lover. I mean, you could think trumpet. Who do you think? Duke Ellington, maybe, coming through. Or, guitarist, a lot of, famous guitarists. But you don't sit there and go, oh man, this one tuba player nailed it this century, and to bring him back would be. And so that's why I was like, we don't think about them, but I'm sure they're out there.
Well, to go off on a weird tangent that your audience will probably find insanely boring, I have a real admiration for the tuba community, and it does exist. Actually, you'd be surprised how deep that particular rabbit hole goes. But back you hear these stories. I remember hearing these stories from several people that in the post-World War II era, there were guys who were landing. And I say guys because it was mostly guys who were auditioning for them. Although one of my teachers in my lineage was a female tuba player who had an amazing career. But there were folks who were landing orchestral tuba player jobs, because they knew their B flat scale. Like that was the only requirement. Like the scale that you learn in middle school after your first year was what was landing these people jobs in orchestra positions. And nowadays those are so coveted. I mean, honestly, you stand a better job. There are more positions as NBA players than there are full-time salaried with benefits paying a good living wage orchestra positions in the United States. Like it's a shockingly narrow pool that's drawn from. And so it's just become highly competitive. And if you look at the tuba community in particular, the distance that they've come in the past 80 years and the things that people are doing on the instrument, it's just, and part of that is because there's this sort of, need for a lot of tuba players to prove themselves because they're the butt of jokes all the time. And, oh, you're not nimble and you can't do this and you can't play high and you can't, double tongue and triple tongue. No, it's some, if you look, there are some players that are doing absolutely phenomenal things out there and are also just being incredible musicians at the same time. So yeah, it's an interesting world, and I straddle both those lines, I guess.
No, that's really admirable, and congratulations on the tuba, because I remember when I was, like you're saying, sixth grade band, and they're like, "What instrument did you want?"
Not the
Everybody would
tuba,
look
right?
at the tuba and be like, "There's no way I can carry that or hold that
Yeah. No,
around
yeah.
all day, so forget it."
Well, I'm a big fella, and my best friend was wanting to play trombone, and I was wanting to play trombone with him too. And my band director, selfishly knowing that he was short on tuba players, said, "Oh no, you need to play tuba," and that's how I got stuck with it. And so you definitely have to find a way to make your own opportunities. Prior to the birth of my sons, several years back, I was doing a lot of teaching and writing, and now it's gotten to the point where I teach and I'm sorry, I was doing teaching, writing, and gigging, and once my sons were born, I dropped the teaching aspect and I just write and gig now, which is partially a function of sticking around in the music scene long enough to get your name out there, but it's really a wonderful thing just to focus on that aspect of it, and it's refreshing because here's the thing that I've noticed about my involvement in the paranormal is that if this is like the only thing that you think about and the only thing that you do and you eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff, it can drive you a little bit mad, I think. I've seen this happen to a couple of people who have really pursued this with their all, and it often, not always, but it often doesn't end well. And so it's nice to, whenever I get frustrated with writing or with some aspects of the paranormal community, to be able to switch to something that's completely different and uses a completely different part of my brain and is with a completely different group of folks. It really is sort of a pressure valve in that respect, and I really, really love it. Yeah.
Well, not to switch subjects abruptly, but we've kind of touched on one, and so I'm going to kind of do a small, as you would say, segue to another topic. Is you talk about fairy sightings, and I'm curious, why just fairies and not the other fae, or is there a reason behind, or do you consider most of the fae as fairies?
Yeah, so I kind of, sometimes people have talked to me or introduced me and they're like, fairy expert Joshua Cutchin, and I'm like, no, trust me, I'm not I'm not the fairy expert, because I have some colleagues that I really, really admire, who really do get especially granular with the fairy lore, because it is so region dependent that you can sort of, um, for example, there was a film that came out a year or two ago, and it was featuring red caps in Ireland, and I knew this fact in the back of my head, but it didn't bother me until one of my colleagues, Morgan Daimler, they pointed out that red caps are strictly an English fairy. So what are they doing in Ireland? I'm like, oh yeah, that's right. So you can get like hyper focused and hyper local and hyper granular with what fairies are. I tend to use it in more of a broad brush. Again, I not inaccurately, but I try to sort of look at the fairy, the body of fairy folklore from more of a 10,000 foot view, and then touch upon these individual things as needed. But once you do that, you start to see that there's a lot of crossover between all these different things. I mean, some of it's really obvious, like elves and fairies and pixies and goblins. They all sort of fall under that fairy umbrella. But once you sort of start to look at these other bodies of folklore, you start to see that a lot of them cross-pollinate with the fairy stuff. A good example of that would be something like mermaids. There are some myths and legends associated with mermaids that are identical to some of the folklore that surrounds, fairies in general. And the same can be said for, giants, which is completely it's completely counterintuitive that you would associate giants with fairies, but a lot of them, a lot of they share a lot of folklore, and then same thing can be said in some instances of dragons, and even something that I go into a bit in Where the Footprints End, even large wild men, like Bigfoot. So I try to take as big a picture as I can when I look at it. And the thing that has always really pulled me in that direction, again, I can't tell you why that one bit of fairy folklore about not eating food in fairyland stuck with me. I have no idea, but for some reason it did, and I have always been drawn to this particular paranormal phenomenon for a long time. And I suppose it's partially the fact that when people are talking about something like Bigfoot or like UFOs, they might say something like, well, of course, UFOs are possible. It's not like we're talking about unicorns or leprechauns. So it's always been interesting to me that like something that we as a culture have come to sort of ridicule and use as an example of something that doesn't exist is still seen to this day. And moreover, still has so much in common with a lot of other paranormal stuff. And part of that's because the term fairy was once used much in the same way that we would use paranormal or supernatural today, right? They'd see something and they'd say, oh, that's fairy, right? But the fact of the matter is that a lot of that fairy folklore, and again, I believe that there's an objective reality to paranormal phenomena in general. And I rarely run across a paranormal topic I don't believe that, right? But so much of fairy folklore has gotten folded in to these other phenomena that we don't really think have anything to do with it. So I can find aspects of fairy folklore in hollow earth conspiracies. I can find it all over the UFO stuff, to the extent that I think that they're one and the same, quite frankly. I can find a ton of it in the Bigfoot stuff. And you can find a ton of it in lake monster stuff as well. There's a close association between fairies and lake monsters too. So that's what I find really attractive about the sort of body of fairy folklore. And again, we're talking about something that's a worldwide phenomenon. A lot of indigenous people around the world had a belief in little people. What I find so attractive about the whole corpus of fairy folklore is the fact that it does have these ties to things that we think are new or interesting, or we'll say, I wonder why this phenomena does X, Y, Z, and it's like, well, if you look back to this older fairy folklore, it's been with us all along. So there's a shocking consistency that's revealed in fairy folklore that has remained through to the present day.
So I'm curious, with you looking at the fairy folklore and the way that you do, I always grew up in the back of my mind, kind of like you're saying, where, you heard something and it kind of sticks there, is fairies can be your friend and can be, helpful, but also tricksters and your worst nightmare if you cross them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that we've sort of swept under the rug as a modern culture, isn't it? We think that fairies are all sweetness and light all the time. And some of these fairy species, races, whatever you want to call them, those specific things that I was talking about, some of them were more benevolently disposed to human beings than others. But again, speaking broadly and generally, they were not always great. They weren't always great to you. It very much depended upon your relationship and the sort of level of deference that you showed to them and the sort of level of respect that you showed to them. Not only, acting maliciously towards them or acting disrespectfully towards them, but also just accidental disrespect. I mean, there are stories of people who were blinded because they stumbled, up against a fairy tree. And it's like, this person didn't do anything wrong, but they still suffer the consequences for it. So yeah, there is a malevolent streak, which does tie in, as you alluded to the tricksterish nature of the fairies. And they could, if you respected them and you treated them right, and maybe you had a cunning man or cunning woman or fairy doctor put in a good word for you, they would do great things for you. They would do the things that you read about in some of the fairy tales, like fixing all your shoes or or tidying up your household or something like that. But if you transgressed in any sort of way, intentionally or unintentionally, it was bad news. Blindness, illness, um, everything up until like bad luck and even death could be attributed to this. A great example of this is if you go to Ireland to this day, you will still see some older homes that have these corners that are sort of lopped off, where you can tell that the masonry has been repaired and it was once coming to a point, but it's since, been made flat. And in some cases, that is because people just put up their homes and they didn't consult any of the magical practitioners in the area as to where the fairy paths were. And they would put up their house, and then everybody in the house would start having bad luck, and that a child would suffer from consumption for months at a time, and they'd be like, oh, maybe I should consult my local sorcerer or sorceress, and that's when they discover that, oh, you actually accidentally built your home over a fairy pathway, and they amend that particular portion of the house. Hopefully it was something like a corner that was a relatively easy fix, and their luck would change. And that too is kind of a good symbol of how, despite us not taking it seriously, fairy folklore remains with us to this very day and is as strong in some ways as it always has been. Not only the UFO alien abduction phenomenon that I mentioned in passing, but also just in pop culture. I mean, so many things that we get from in fantasy and science fiction even come from fairy folklore. And you could argue that even in our language, I mean, I'm sure there are other examples in languages other than English, but if you just look at English alone, that in the medical term stroke is a direct reference to the fairy stroke, where the fairy would touch you and you would have a fit and become paralyzed. The term cobalt is derived from the mineral cobalt, but that mineral was named for the kobolds, the knockers in the German mind. So there are these little things that are sort of filtered their way down to us through time, and it really influences and impacts a lot of the way that we think about the world, even though we don't always appreciate that presence that's still with us.
So I'm curious, you touched on it a little bit with the fairy kind, that like for example, the gods, the ancient gods, say the Greek gods, Roman gods, their story, they say they cease to exist once mankind no longer believes in them. Or you could say they simply left. How does that work with fairy kind? Do they continue to exist even when people are like they don't exist, or do they suffer from that?
That's a good question. Every now and then you read a work of fiction and you're like, I think they're getting pretty close to what's actually going on. And what you just said put me in the mindset of Neil Gaiman's American Gods, where there are these deities that sort of thrive on how much they're believed. I would say that fairy folklore is exceptionally resilient and malleable. And what I mean by that specifically is that as early as Chaucer, you see references to this exodus of the fairies, and they would describe these little wagons pulled by tiny ponies, and the fairies were leaving, and the reasons for that were ascribed to any number of things, everything from the advances in technology to humans encroaching into the wilderness to the church. But the fairy exodus never stopped. Like, you can find contemporary stories still describing the fairies leaving, as the author Patrick Harper once said, leaving, but never gone. Similarly, the aliens are coming, but never here. Right? That was another observation that Patrick Harper made. But fairy folklore does a good job of traveling with cultures. It was once thought that fairy folklore did not make the transatlantic voyage with early settlers outside of New England. That's simply not true. You can find Tommy Knocker legends from Cornwall that made their way all the way to Montana. And similarly, a lot of those beliefs came here and they syncretized with a lot of indigenous North American beliefs that in a lot of ways sound like they're describing the exact same thing. That's especially prominent with Cherokee fairy beliefs in my part of the country. But I would argue that what fairy folklore does is that it also diffuses really well, and it does get picked up by these other phenomena, or they're the same phenomena. So a good example that I like to use of this is that there is a line of thought amongst some Bigfoot researchers that Bigfoot likes to steal into stables at night and braid horses' manes. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, right? It sounds a little silly. I have read an account from a Russian researcher who says that something happens similar. He actually witnessed something happening similar with a Russian version of Bigfoot, the Almasty. But what's interesting about that idea of breaking into a stable and braiding horses' manes at night, which, let's face it, is probably just tangled manes from the day before, is that if you were to take that exact same phenomenon and transplant it to, Devon in 1852 or something, it would be blamed on the fairies. And indeed, to this day, in some of the parts that fairy folklore was best imported to the New World, places like Nova Scotia, that's still something that people will blame on fairies, these sort of horses' manes being braided. Now, you get out to Montana, where fewer people care about fairies. There isn't that sort of rich tradition still there, and people start to blame it on things like Bigfoot. So you have these individual aspects of fairy folklore that sort of get scattered into these other paranormal domains. I would argue strongly that the UFO phenomenon picked up a lot of these attributes more strongly than anywhere else. I mean, I don't want to go too far down this particular rabbit hole because it's it's deep, right? But there are a lot of examples that you can use. Some of them are very superficial, like, little green men being a derivative of little men in green, through to things like, a lot of these reports that you hear from alien abductees are these smaller worker drones and this taller supervising gray alien, right? And that sounds like an exact reworking of the smaller fairies and fairy royalty, fairy queens and fairy kings that stood the size of your average human being, while the other fairies were shorter. Even something like alien implants, which seems very technological, very futuristic, has a direct analog in fairy folklore. I was astonished to discover this, but amongst alien abductees who have had these objects removed from various parts of their body, they are generally revealed to be some sort of foreign object that gets under the skin and has calcium that accretes around it and whatnot. But and they say, oh no, it's so advanced it doesn't appear to be technology. But if you look back into the fairy folklore, the words blast, blister, and blustery all share the same Germanic root, because if you offended the fairies through one of those many ways that we discussed just a moment ago, they might hit you with a big gust of blustery wind in something that was called the fairy blast. And the fairy blast would leave a blister. And once it was opened up, it was filled with all sorts of things, everything from teeth to bones to sticks and leaves to bits of string and just all sorts of just junk, right? So to me, that sounds like a direct reinvention of this older idea of the fairy blast, the lesion filled with trash, in the modern alien abduction scenario. And again, that's just one of about probably 30 examples that I've collected over the years. And it's gotten to the point where I think that if you see something in the modern UFO literature, you can find an analog in the fairy folklore. And if you see something in fairy folklore, you can find an analog in the modern UFO literature. I don't know if that means that yesterday's fairies were actually aliens. I don't know if that means that today's aliens are actually fairies. I tend to suspect that these are both two culture-dependent ways of describing this same phenomenon that human beings just don't have the proper language to express in objective terms.
Right. And it's interesting how you point out, like, they're still around in today's nomenclature, or however you say that word. Like, an example is, I was raised where if I set my keys, say, on the counter, and then they're not there. The
Yep.
fairies took your keys. You need
Yep.
to ask them to give them back. And so they're still, it's almost like you're saying, as much as we try to erase them, they're always going to be there because it's
Yeah.
always somehow in our language or something we're taught.
Oh,
In
a
our mind.
hundred. Yeah, you just sort of swim in this cultural soup, and you don't realize how many of these things you pick up. But there are things like that, and I love that example because that's very consistent with what you would hear about this sort of tricksterish behavior of these things. And it gets borrowed in science fiction all the time. There was a Netflix series a little while back. Spoilers for, I believe it was called Katla. It was an Icelandic series, and there were these doubles of people that were showing up all the time, and that's really derivative of the changeling folklore that you hear in these older fairy stories. And but the reason behind this, because we're in the 2020s or whatever, is was an extraterrestrial meteorite had landed, and that was causing people to duplicate. And I'm like, okay, well, you're just taking fairy lore and you're just grafting it onto something that sounds extraterrestrial to make it more palatable, more believable to your audience. But it really is the same idea, just getting reworked. So it's almost like appropriately enough, because sometimes they were said to live underground. It's almost like fairy folklore sort of went underground and sort of injected itself into all these other more modern beliefs that are more believable to folks in the 21st century.
I'm curious your thoughts on something I've kind of toyed with, because mankind evolves, aliens, evolved from where they started from to where they are today, and our beliefs, it could be the other way around. They're evolving the same way we are, but I'm wondering because fairies were around, and then as fairies started to get quieter, like you're saying, going underground, we started hearing the term elemental, that
Mm.
the elementals were around. So I'm curious, did the fairies evolve into elementals?
Well, I guess that sort of depends on your perspective on what these things in all of the paranormal are. So if you believe, and I suspect this myself, that our cultural and societal expectations of what this phenomena is and what we call it, if you suspect that there's a dialogue between the supernatural and what we expect it to be, then I think that there is an evolution there. I think that there's sort of a two-way exchange of between expectation and what it is. I will say that this question is also sort of tied up in what fairies supposedly were to begin with, which seems like it should be an easy thing to pin down, but it's still much debated amongst fairy scholars. There is the long-standing belief that the fairies were sort of demoted pagan deities or lesser gods and goddesses of the landscape that sort of fell from grace as Christianity arose, and they became fairies as opposed to things to be worshipped. There is this idea that they are nature spirits. That idea is tied into these older Greco-Roman ideas of a spirit of place called genus loci. But at the same time, it's also tied up in the work of, I believe it was a 16th century alchemist by the name of Paracelsus, who divided spirits into these elemental categories of, the salamanders were for fire, and the gnomes were for earth, and I think there were 4 or 5 sylphs were for the ether, for the air. And those ideas sort of have their own trajectory, which I'll get to in a moment. But of the other explanations for what the fairies were slash are, is that they were perhaps angels that were too good for hell and too bad for heaven, or they were angels that were outside of hell or the pearly gates during the great battle between heaven and hell, and they first fell to the ground, and that's where they stayed, wherever they fell. Obviously, Christianity had a certain amount of say so in there. There's also a strong case to be made, which is a lot of what my book Ecology of Souls deals with. A strong case to be made that fairies were a way of conceptualizing the human dead. In fact, prior to the late 19th century, a lot of communities said that either you died in became a fairy, or that he sometimes to become a fairy, or that fairies are somehow involved in the death process. And sure enough, especially in Western Europe, again, I can make it elsewhere in the world, but especially in Western Europe, there are all these stories of people who go to fairyland and they end up being dead neighbors and dead relatives there in fairyland. So there is some sort of connection to death there. But going back to this idea of elementals, Paracelsus comes up with these ideas of elementals. They get adopted by folks like Steiner, and they get brought into this late 19th century mystical movement known as Theosophy. I'm not sure if you've ever looked into Theosophy before, but Theosophy colors so much of what we understand thinking about the paranormal nowadays. And that's when this idea of very strictly as elementals really changes. I tend to adopt an idea that was put forth by the former professor at the Sorbonne by the name of Claude Lecoq, who writes excellent books on these topics. And Claude Lecoq outlined a mechanism which I've seen discussed by other scholars, wherein a person in in a pre-Christian era, a person who was revered by a community, by a tribe, what have you, perhaps a chieftain or a warrior or a chiefess or something along those lines, would be buried in a certain place. And over time, that place would become sacred. And people would go there and they'd make offerings to the person who was buried there. But also over time, that memory of exactly who that person was as a living human being can fade. And the actual memory of that person sort of evolved into being a spirit of place, which is very much tied into the idea of a nature spirit or an elemental. And we've actually been fortunate enough to see some of this sort of phenomenon unfold in real time. There are clear indications that some of these ghosts and demons and even fairies that inhabit or occupy crossroads in places like Western Europe were criminals that were executed at crossroads and fairies that sort of over the years evolved into this kind of spirit. There's also a precedent for it in indigenous Buriat shamans. They're actually interred, buried in one place, and then later they're dug back up and buried in another place for the specific purpose of becoming sort of a spirit of that particular area or that particular region. So there does seem to be like this evolution that you alluded to, wherein even something like a human being can be buried, and over time belief and memory sort of blur what they were, and they become something like a fairy or a spirit of place. And again, in my worldview of the paranormal, that means that yes, that's exactly what happened. Like it's not once a ghost, always a ghost. Like your identity as a spirit is sort of dependent upon what people expect you, what people expect you to be. So you could become like a very long-winded way of answering your question, but the idea of fairy origins itself is super complex.
No, and I'm grateful for the answer because it really makes it clear and kind of ties it together to where it's like, yeah, I understand more what they were saying and looking at instead of just going, yeah, we went from A to B. Okay, no explanation, but sure, why not?
Yeah, don't let anyone tell you that fairies are just this or just that, because the answer is super complex. And even some of my colleagues that I referred to, whom I admire, they'll say the exact same thing. None of us know what fairies started out as. It's this never-ending question that we're still wrestling with to this day. Yeah.
Yeah, and the reason too why I was thinking it, so to kind of clarify my line of thinking where I was thinking this is elementals are protectors spirits. Fairies were protectorates of fairyland, nature. And so it's like, in my mind, I'm like, well, you have one protector. You evolve it. What's it going to do? It's going to protect something else. Well, what's a bigger protector than a small fairy? An elemental. And when you see images of them, they look similar in some instances.
No, I completely agree, and I'm super sympathetic. Like, part of me really wants them to be, part of me wants them to be nature spirits and elementals, because I love that idea of it being an intelligence that never was even once human. But it's such a complex question.
Right.
But you're right. Like many of them do serve. They are very closely tied to place. Obviously there are some landmarks that are named Fairy this and Fairy that, or the Pixie's Den or something like that. But they are very much tied to landmarks, ancient monuments, mountains, caves, streams, glens, stuff like that. And that does really put you in the mindset of them being sort of protectors of that space. And it's true. Like if you misbehave in those spaces, you're going to pay for it probably.
Right. And one of the things that's kind of funny too is I'm kind of a fan of the Hallmark movies, and they did a movie where they were going to develop this golf course that happened to be on fairy land, and they couldn't get the plans approved until, like you were saying, the local sorcerer, so to speak, approved the plan. And it was like great how they brought that.
I love that.
It was like, yeah, we could easily have the story, but it's great to find this one little thing that makes this area unique compared to everywhere else.
I need to check that out. I haven't seen it. I would love to. It's really interesting. Like to this day, it doesn't happen as much as it did in Ireland, but you can run across references to this throughout the 70s and 80s, and there's still a good deal of this. But construction projects would be halted or diverted because it would involve knocking down a fairy tree or something. Like, and there are stories. Again, the ones that I'm most familiar with come from like the 70s of construction workers and contractors just folding their arms and refusing to go any further because they don't want to risk it. And of course, when somebody decides to risk it, there's a peculiar accident with an excavator or something like that.
Yeah, there's a downfall somewhere.
Yep. But that does speak to the fact. I had the good fortune of going to Ireland in 2017 and walking into a pub and talking to a 20-something about fairies, and the topic comes up, and one of the things that I heard often was well, of course I don't believe in fairies, but I'm scared of them. Like it's sort of like I don't want to go there, don't want to test and try it. So again, it's just fascinating to me that this is still a living body of folklore that we just treat so flippantly,
But it is humorous how I've heard that too, where they'll be adamant fairies don't exist, and then you go, "Oh, so you're gonna do this? No, I don't want to cross them." Like,
yeah.
Well, what are you crossing? If you don't believe them, what are you crossing?
Yeah, I mean, you sort of run into people like this in America who are like, ghosts don't exist, and then the moment you try to get them to go with you into the haunted house, they suddenly get real skittish. Yeah.
So I'm curious because we have like less than 6 minutes left, and I don't know if you can go longer or not. But one of the things I wanted to ask is with around the cryptids. And we talked about mermaids. And as we were talking about them and you mentioned them, my first thought popped in my head and goes, is a mermaid a cryptid or a fairy? And even further is I've heard of a place in Washington where the government Department of Energy made cryptids. They actually admitted to crossbreeding animals with humans to create super animals. And so could a mermaid be an after effect of that?
Well, as to your first question, it's a great thing to ask, because depending upon whom you ask, you'll get different answers. There are cryptozoologists who have done extensive work on mermaids. Lauren Coleman, sort of the godfather of Christianity, the godfather of cryptozoology, just recently released a book on mermaids, taking a look at sightings, and they come from everywhere, and they are still seen today. So yeah, I mean, it all depends on one's perspective. I find myself in the topic of something like mermaids from a flesh and blood perspective. I find myself in the same position that I found myself when I embarked on writing Where the Footprints End with Bigfoot. I think we should have a body of these things if they existed in that sort of flesh and blood way. At the same time, I talk to these people who will tell me things. One example that I love to use is that I spoke confidentially with someone who was didn't really want to share their experience in terms of putting their name on it, right? But a very well balanced individual from all appearances who saw a cat person step across the road. So at some point you've got to reconcile the fact that we don't have more bulletproof physical evidence, and yet there are honest, decent people who see these things, right? So you've got to sort of try to make those things play together and reconcile them. So I know that the ocean is vast and deep and it's less explored than the moon. I know all those stats, but I would think that we would have a little bit more evidence of a flesh and blood mermaid. So in that sense, I sort of lean towards them being something more like fairies, something that is, you can call it spirit, you can call it interdimensional, whatever you want to call it. And that's sort of the direction that I lean into. And that's similarly for those reasons. I don't really know what to do with some of these stories of government experiments creating hybrids. My inner 12-year-old really loves that idea that there's something out there that is roaming around, and we can, if in sort of a late Saturday matinee movie style, we can get the community together and we can defend ourselves. I think that's a really fun idea. But I just don't know. And in my time spent around the UFO topic, I just see so much deception and disinformation and reading between the lines with a lot of these stories about the government that I just don't know what to make of it. So who knows? I mean, I'm not going to say that that's not possible and that's not the case. It's not the direction that I would go with it. But these stories don't go away, right? Of these chimeras and these hybridizations. So I know some people have claimed that that's what's going on with the Dogman phenomenon as well. And so I like to tell people a lot of us have two baskets in our head, right? One says true and one says false. My true and false baskets are really small, and there's a gigantic basket in the middle that says interesting if true, and a lot of stuff goes in there. So that's kind of where I sit with that.
Right. And to clarify, the guest that I had on my show that was talking about the Gorge area in Washington where all this happened was during World War II, when they were trying to protect the uranium, I believe, deposits in that area from spies. And they were like, well, we can't use dolphins because dolphins can't get that far in. So
I love that, though. That's so cool.
They said there was an article where the Department of Energy was in charge of it and said, hey, we were making a stronger, better crocodile. So if you come across it, could you let us know? Because it kind of escaped.
That's not terrifying. That sounds about right, though. And here's the other thing that I think is important to remember. As much as I step away from stories like that, I think that there are things going on that we have no idea about. And I think some of the stuff that we think isn't true is, and some of the stuff that we think is true isn't, So who knows? I love that story, though, because I've always loved those stories about, dolphins being used in espionage and stuff like that. So the idea that you get a super crocodile or even a mermaid to help out with that is super cool.
And I even said to him, because he said it in passing, and I was like, wait.
Yeah, go back.
Back up a second. You mean the government actually admitted something? And he goes, yeah, they actually did. I was like, that was the shocking part. It was like, wait.
and let's be clear. Like, if this is possible, they would totally do it, right? Or they are totally doing it. You know what I'm saying? Like, if like it's the only thing that's holding them back from doing something like that is logistics. Like, so I have no doubt that people are continuing to work at something like that if it hasn't already happened. Yeah.
And the reason I picked the mermaid as for the question is, there's been so much folklore around them of, like, I know this is not reality, but the Peter Pan version where, they were the, hey, Peter, the happy-go-lucky just laying around. And then there's the Pirates of the Caribbean mermaids that are like will suck your soul and steal you. And and
Closer, yeah.
then there's Fantasy Island, the new one. I don't know if you saw that one, but Elena Rourke runs it, and she says we have a deal with the mermaids where they use their magic to keep our island hidden, and people can have their experiences, but we don't fight them, but we don't also allow them to take our people, but they'll try to steal people and steal their lives. And so it's like we have all these different views of what is a mermaid. That it's a fairy, because it's the same thing. Fairies we cannot define.
It all gets sanitized, right? Like all the fairy stuff gets sanitized. Dragons got sanitized. I mean, if you look back to medieval texts and sort of the way that people were conceptualizing dragons, like dragons and Satan were like synonymous. It's kind of one and the same. Like dragons were very rarely ever benevolent things. And mermaids are a classic example of that, going all the way back to from when they were sirens and the Greek myths and whatnot. They were a peril. They weren't something that you could buddy up with. So yeah, the Peter Pan version. Although it's interesting. I my sons really love the Disney animated Peter Pan, and rewatching that with a folklorist's eyes. I have not read the Barry book, so I'll have to defer. I realize that Disney might have changed some stuff, but rewatching that with a folklorist's eyes, it's interesting because there's some odd stuff to be said about the whole thing as a metaphor for death. These children who are taken away by Peter Pan. And there is a passage in Barry's Peter Pan book that I did read, this particular passage that says that Wendy's mother recalled stories of Peter Pan taking children who had died to Never Never Land. And once you have that in your head, you're like, oh, this sort of starts to look like that. Like, Captain Hook is not so much afraid as the crocodile as he's afraid of time catching up with him. So there's some stuff in there that really does. There's some depth in there that I hadn't appreciated before I got interested in all this stuff.
Well, and it's interesting too, talking about the Peter Pan version, is if you remember when Wendy lands by them and they're all around her, what's the one thing they do? They're like grabbing on her and they're wanting to pull her down, and they said, let's drown her. Let's see if she.
That's right. Yep. There is an illusion. Yeah. So one of the other things that I released last year was a collection of essays that I was the editor on, and I also contributed one essay, but it was on fairies in film, and it was sort of looking at what we've talked about a bit about tonight. This idea of how we don't really appreciate how much fairy folklore is in all of our lives, and so just looking at movies, you can see there are these films that don't ever really mention fairies, where fairy folklore gets sort of pushed into it or ends up in there. So some of the films, the original Dune is talked about in one essay. Rocky Horror Picture Show is talked about in one essay. A good friend of mine wrote an essay on fairy folklore in this Japanese horror film called Marabito. But yeah, it really is all over the place. And one of the essays by someone else whom I admire greatly, Dr. Simon Young, somebody who I would call a fairy expert, talks about sort of rescuing this idea that Disney fairies are bad, because a lot of us who are interested in fairy folklore, Disney's the first example that we point to saying that's not what fairies were actually like. But there's an argument to be made that there are some aspects of fairy folklore that were accurate in some of those classic animated films, and that's one of the specific examples that he uses, where the mermaids want to drown Wendy. It's like, yep, that's spot on.
And also Tinkerbell, what did she want to do? She wanted the Lost Boys to shoot her down.
Yep.
And kill Wendy.
And she was motivated by her affections towards Peter Pan, which is again this sort of something you see in a lot of these fairy stories going way back. The idea of fairies wanting to be intimate with human beings as well, and assuming that Peter was once a human being at some point. One of the older Barry stories talks about um, Peter sort of being if I remember correctly, the soul of a child who was sort of lost. So he started out as human in that capacity. So yeah,
I think the movie Hook talks about that because it's like he has that memory of being the child in the.
mm-hmm. That's right. I haven't seen Hook in forever. I should go back and watch it.
But with the new movie Dune Part 2 out, when you mentioned Dune attached with fairies, my thought was, are we talking about the Fremen? Or how do fairies come into Dune?
Yeah, well, this wasn't my essay. That's so I can't recall all the aspects of it off the top of my head. But that was part of the thrust, was that the Fremen residing underground could be conceptualized as that. And if you look at the Lynch version, where they have, if my memory serves, they have these like sort of ray guns. There was a comparison to be made that there were that was similar to, like, the invisible elf shot and stuff. And comparisons to the spice and sort of the magical powers of the fairies. It was an interesting perspective. Yeah, it was an interesting perspective.
Now that I think about it, they could ride the worm, and so
yeah, so there's sort of that nature a close relationship with nature that we were talking about earlier too. Yeah, they've tamed the untamable on Arrakis. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, we've run a little bit over, and I know you have two twins, so I'm sure they're either asleep or wanting attention. So before I let you go, where can people find your books and you?
JoshuaCutchin.com, JoshuaCutchin.com. I try to keep everything there updated as far as appearances and news about me. And depending on, if I'm working on something new at the time, it might be a little bit of time between updates, but I always try to keep everybody aware of when I have a new book coming out or an appearance to interact with me. So all my interviews go up there as well. And I have some of my books, not all of them, but some of my books. You can reach out to me directly, and I can send an autographed copy. We'll discuss that. So,
okay. And you mentioned having your interviews on there. Would you like me to send you a copy of the interview?
Yeah, please do. Please do. Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, I will. And before we go, one thing with this being season 2 that I've started messing with and trying out is there a golden nugget of information from your journey that you'd like to share with people?
My bit of advice would be to, well, number one, I would quote John Keel and say belief is the enemy when it comes to these topics. Like, never let yourself get too hardened in being too sure about what these things are or aren't. But the other thing that I would emphasize is that I think we should all take some time to reevaluate how well we actually have defined the boundary between physical and non-physical. And what I mean by that is when I wrote Where the Footprints End with my co-author Timothy Renner, one of the sort of bits of pushback that I would hear from time to time, because the basic thrust of those two books is that Bigfoot is not a giant ape, right? And one of the counterpoints that people would say would be things like, well, ghosts don't leave footprints. And I'm like, if you read your parapsychology, if you go back and look, that was like the Victorian method for ghost hunting, right? Is to put talcum powder on the floor and wait for footprints. And ghosts slam doors and ghosts move objects. So similarly, psi phenomena, if it exists, which I think it's been proven in the laboratory by a lot of people, it's the research is extremely good on that effect. Psi phenomena is in your head, but it interacts with this reality that we all share. So I think that goes to show us that we don't really quite understand this internal, external separation, this physical, psychic, physical, non-physical separation. So I would encourage people to entertain the idea that is less of a well-defined boundary than we think it is. And once you sort of realize that, you can overlay that onto a lot of paranormal phenomena, UFOs, ghosts, Bigfoot, fairies, any of this stuff. And I don't know if it helps it make sense in the way that, like, you know about it better and you know something about it. It's not what I'm saying, but it allows you to sort of reconcile some of the things that are so confusing, I think, about a lot of these phenomena. So to sort of entertain that possibility that we don't really have a good grasp on what it means to be the difference between something you think about saying and something you say, right? Or like a movie that you think about making and a movie that you've made. Everything starts as a thought and then it gets brought into the physical world. And I wonder if that's not what we're dealing with sometimes with these topics.
That's beautifully said, and that's you actually got me thinking about that now. Going, how much of that is true? How much is thought being brought in, and what are we creating, and everything? And it's like, wow,
some food for thought.
Yes. And so, with that, I'm going to say, wherever you are in the world, good night, good day. Blessings to you, Joshua, for coming on, and we hope that you'll come on again.
Absolutely.
And for everyone that's watching, thank you to the chat room and those of you watching. So wherever you are in the world, please make it a blessed day. Fill it with love and joy. Good night, everyone.